Being poor in medieval times was basically torture. You wake up to a church bell that sounds like it's ringing directly inside your skull, stumble out of a house made of literal mud and straw, and get ready for another 16-hour shift of farming someone else's land. Fun times. You're a serf. Not quite a slave, but close enough that the distinction doesn't really matter when you're face down in dirt at sunrise. The year is somewhere around 1200, and you live in a village that consists of maybe 40 families all crammed into hovels that would make a modern garden shed look luxurious. The bell keeps ringing because the priest wants everyone at morning prayers. Missing them isn't an option. The priest is technically a peasant too, but he's got the kind of job security you'll never have. He can read, which makes him basically a wizard in your eyes, and he spends most of his sermons reminding you that your miserable existence is actually God's plan. Work hard, obey your Lord, don't steal, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get rewarded in the afterlife. Emphasis on maybe. After prayers, the real day begins. If you're one of the lucky ones, you might be a blacksmith or a miller. Those jobs still suck, but at least you're not in the fields. Most people aren't that lucky. Most people are out there with scythes and sickles harvesting grain they'll never get to eat. See, here's the thing about being a serf. You don't own the land you work. Your Lord does. You're assigned a strip of dirt to farm, and everything you grow on it technically belongs to Him. You get to keep just enough to not starve. Barely. The rest goes straight up to the castle as rent and taxes. Your day is spent bent over in the sun, planting or harvesting depending on the season. Corn, barley, oats, rye. The work is endless and backbreaking. Around midday, you get a break. Lunch is bread and pottage, which is just a fancy word for watery vegetable stew. It tastes like sadness, but it's calories, so you shovel it down. Then the church bell rings again because apparently the priest thinks you forgot about God during the 3 hours you spent pulling weeds. Back to prayers, back to work, repeat until sunset. Your house, if you can call it that, is one room. No windows. The walls are a mix of twigs, clay, dirt, and animal dung. Yes, dung. Structurally important dung. At night, you bring the livestock inside because leaving them out means they'll get stolen or eaten by wolves. So you're sleeping in the same room as a cow. The hearth in the middle keeps things warm, but it also fills the space with smoke, so you're constantly choosing between freezing and choking. But there is one bright spot in this whole arrangement: ale. Glorious, untaxed ale. It's part of your payment for working the land, which means everyone has access to it. The local drinking house is where you go to forget that your entire life is a cycle of exhausting labor with no escape. People play dice, cards, and a primitive form of bowling. Fights break out regularly. It's chaos, but it's your chaos. Still, even ale can't fix the bigger problem. Death is everywhere. Half of all babies don't make it past their first birthday. Disease runs rampant because nobody understands hygiene. Waste gets tossed into the streets or the river, the same river people drink from. Bathing happens twice in your entire life, once when you're born, once when you're dead. But that's just the beginning of how bad things really get. Being poor in medieval times was basically torture. And the worst part, it stays that way for centuries. You're not living in some transitional era where things are slowly improving. You're trapped in a system that's been grinding people down since Rome collapsed, and it's going to keep grinding for another 1,000 years. Around the 10th century, towns start popping up more frequently. For a brief moment, you think maybe this is your chance. More jobs, more opportunities, a way out of the mud. But here's what actually happens. More people crammed together means disease spreads faster. Congratulations, you traded rural misery for urban plague. The villages are filthy, but the towns? They're biological warfare zones, no sewage systems, no concept of germs. People are still throwing waste into the streets and drinking from the same rivers they're dumping bodies into. You're living in what scientists would later call a petri dish. But with more stabbing, then 1346 rolls around. The Black Death arrives like the world's worst house guest and proceeds to kill a third of Europe. Tens of millions dead. Every class, every region, no one's safe. Your neighbors drop like flies. Your family drops. Half the village is gone within months. But here's the twisted part. For those who survive, things actually start to change. Suddenly, there aren't enough workers. Farms sit empty because everyone who knew how to run them is buried in mass graves. Grain prices collapse. The lords who've spent centuries treating peasants like replaceable tools now realize they're in trouble. They need you more than you need them. So people start pushing back. You've spent your entire life being told to stay in your lane, but now you're demanding better wages, better treatment. Some peasants straight up revolt, storming castles and telling their lords exactly where they can shove their taxes. It doesn't always work, but the fact that it's happening at all is revolutionary. The nobles, facing the reality that they can't run their estates without workers, actually start making concessions. Slowly, painfully slowly, but it's movement. Wages improve. Some serfs gain freedoms. Education becomes slightly more accessible. You start seeing peasants in positions that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Of course, this doesn't happen overnight. Serfdom doesn't get abolished for hundreds of years, but the foundation of the old system has cracks now, and those cracks keep spreading. By the time the 16th century arrives, Europe looks different, not perfect. Still plenty of suffering to go around, but the medieval period, that 1,000-year stretch of feudal misery, is finally ending. The modern world is starting to take shape. You won't live to see it, neither will your kids or their kids. But somewhere down the line, your descendants will wake up in a world where they're not legally bound to a strip of dirt, where they can choose their work, where bathing happens more than twice in a lifetime. The medieval peasant life was a special kind of hell. Endless labor, constant disease, zero upward mobility, and a system designed to keep you exactly where you were born. You worked yourself to death so nobles could live in castles and eat meat while you survived on bread and watery stew. But even the most oppressive systems eventually break. It just takes a plague, a few revolts, and several centuries of slow, grinding change. The Middle Ages ended not with a bang, but with exhausted peasants finally getting a slightly better deal. Some peasants straight up revolt, storming castles and telling their lords exactly where they can shove their taxes. It doesn't always work, but the fact that it's happening at all is revolutionary. The nobles, facing the reality that they can't run their estates without workers, actually start making concessions, slowly, painfully slowly. But it's movement. Wages improve. Some serfs gain freedoms. Education becomes slightly more accessible. You start seeing peasants in positions that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. So, yeah, being a medieval peasant was absolutely brutal. You worked until your body gave out, lived in a house made of cow dung, and your biggest luxury was getting drunk enough to forget about it all. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom as a society. Eventually, the only way left to go is up. It just took a few hundred years and a continental plague to get there.